VP-11, which is the squadron I was in, got credit for sinking over 100,000 tons of enemy shipping and damaging 100,000 tons. And we were just one of the Black Cat squadrons out there. So if the others were doing as well, the Japs were hurting pretty bad. Went to San Diego, reformed the squadron. I was kept with the squadron. And we deployed again in April, back to the South Pacific. And that's when we got involved in Black Cat operation primarily. Done a lot of rescue work. Every time there's a big bombing by our carriers or the Air Force on one of the islands, we'd have 3 or 4 planes out in the perimeter standing by to pick up anyone that was shot down. And that was really a blessing to the aviators and to us as well. The pilots loved our airplane, the PBY, really because they had all the runway they needed. VP-11, which is the squadron I was in, got credit for sinking over 100,000 tons of enemy shipping and damaging 100,000 tons. And we were just one of the Black Cat squadrons out there. So if the others were doing as well, the Japs were hurting pretty bad. Went to San Diego, reformed the squadron. I was kept with the squadron. And we deployed again in April, back to the South Pacific. And that's when we got involved in Black Cat operation primarily. Done a lot of rescue work. Every time there's a big bombing by our carriers or the Air Force on one of the islands, we'd have 3 or 4 planes out in the perimeter standing by to pick up anyone that was shot down. And that was really a blessing to the aviators and to us as well. The pilots loved our airplane, the PBY, really because they had all the runway they needed to get airborne. And number 2, we had a lot of runways out there, and they came in handy quite frequently. But my PBY days were my life. That was my first tour, and I had 3 years with them. And you just absolutely, the good thing about it, we each had our own airplane. We maintained our own plane and flew our own plane in most cases. But the biggest challenge we had was pulling our checks while tied up at a buoy. You can imagine how difficult that would be to work on an engine. We did have engine stands that strapped around the engine, but if you dropped anything, it was gone. Spark plug or a tool or what have you. So we had to be very patient, be very careful in holding our maintenance tied up at a buoy. We were stationed in Port Moresby, New Guinea, in a tent city set up by the Seabees, and that's when we got involved in a evacuation of 219 Australian commandos. This happened in December 1943. Our squadron got picked to go in the northern part of New Guinea, where the Australian commandos were still fighting the enemy. We had secured the southern part of New Guinea at that time, so we had a pretty good base at Port Moresby. But the Australian commandos, when they needed supplies, we dropped supplies to them. It got to the point that they were kind of getting overrun and asked to be repositioned. Our squadron got picked to make this rescue. The PBY has a wingspan of 104 feet, and we had to land on the Seebeek River, which was 200 feet wide. So we made 19 individual trips in there to get these people out. We went in on a skeleton crew of only 5 people and no ordnance. We had to go in light to bring the big load out. Each plane came out with 25 commandos and some of their equipment. And there's 5 of us, so that was 30 people in each PBY. Fortunately, there's no mishaps. We got them all out of there in a 5-day period. And they were happy. They had a base south of us in New Guinea, but our main concern after getting loaded, I had to keep them all forward, and they just hung on to each other. And our main concern was that there's no debris coming down that river while we was trying to take off. That spoiled our whole day. But we did get them all out of there, and that was one of the biggest rescue operations, I guess, in the Pacific at that time.
Greetings, folks, and welcome to another edition of History Up Close. We're very excited today to have this event, again, sponsored by the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation and brought to you by Hellcat Productions. Today, we're going to talk about one of the workhorses of the fleet during World War II, the PBY Catalina flying boat. And backed by popular demand is our wonderful, wonderful presenter, Kim Sheldon. Kim, take it away.
Thank you, Captain Gillum. Many airplane designs became famous during World War II, but few emerged from the carnage of that conflict as well loved and respected as the consolidated PBY Catalina. A pioneering design when it first flew in 1935, it was considered by many to be obsolete by the time the United States was thrust into World War II in 1941. But as often is the case, war is a come-as-you-are affair, and the PBY was what the Navy had on hand. Slow and ungainly, the PBY was an easy target for enemy fighters, but what it lacked in speed and agility, it more than made up for with long endurance, rugged construction, and versatility. The PBY went by many nicknames: P-Boat, Catalina, Black Cat, Mad Cat, Nomad, and Dumbo. But whatever it was called, if you were a seaman or airman downed in the ocean, floating in your Mae West or a rubber lifeboat, and a Catalina appeared overhead, it was a guardian angel personified. Its long endurance and range made it ideal as a reconnaissance and patrol aircraft. Its ability to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, depth charges, or torpedoes made it ideal as a sub-hunter or a night intruder. And its ability to land and take off in the open ocean made it ideal as a rescue craft. It became a jack of all trades that served with every Allied Air Force in every theater of World War II, and served in whatever capacity it was asked to perform so well that in fact after the war was over it stayed in service with the militaries long after more modern and faster flying boats became available. Hi, I'm Lieutenant Commander Kim Sheldon, United States Navy retired, and I'm pleased to be here to be your host again for another episode of History Up Close and talk to you about the PBY Catalina. Consolidated designed the PBY Catalina in response to a Navy requirement for a long-range flying boat that could fly nonstop from the west coast of the United States to Hawaii. Consolidated had previously built seaplanes for the Navy, the PY-1 and the P-2Y. PY-1 was actually the Navy's very first monoplane flying boat, but in a strange quirk of fate, although Consolidated designed the PY-1, Martin Aircraft Company got the contract to actually build it. The PY-1 was, as I said, the first monoplane. The next model that Consolidated designed was the P-2Y. This was an innovative airplane. It had an enclosed cockpit, enclosed bow turret, and now engines that were, instead of being supported by struts, were actually built into the leading edge of the wing, which is a dramatic decrease in drag for the airplane. Following on the P-2Y came the XP-3Y, which was designed to answer the Navy's requirement for a long-range flying boat. The Navy, however, wanted more than just a patrol plane. They wanted also a bomber. So the P-3Y became the PBY, P for patrol, B for bomber, and Y was the Navy's manufacturer suffix for Consolidated. The PBY first flew as the P-3Y in 1935, and after winning Navy contract went into production in 1936. PBYs rolled off the line, and from 1936 to 1940 evolved with a succession of models from the PBY 1, 2, 3, 4, and finally the PBY 5, which is what we have here in the museum. This was the most produced of all the PBY Catalinas, which totaled 3,300 from the time they went into production in 1936 until production ceased in 1945. Consolidated Aircraft, chaired by founder Reuben Fleet, moved its factory from Buffalo, New York in 1935 to San Diego in time to begin production on the PBY for the Navy. Subcontracts were let to other companies, including Boeing of Canada in Vancouver, Vickers Aircraft in Montreal, and a new consolidated plant towards the end of the war was constructed in New Orleans. In addition, the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia produced a much modified and modernized version of the PBY referred to as the PBN Nomad, which mostly went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. To describe the PBY's external characteristics, most noticeable about its design was the high parasol-mounted wing. The hull and fuselage were suspended under by a single pylon. It's reinforced by a couple of struts on either side of the fuselage and wing. It was a twin-engine configuration powered by two Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines producing 1,200 horsepower apiece. What gave the aircraft its long range was that incredibly long wingspan. The wing was used to carry the fuel for the airplane, which was carried in the center wing section, total of about 1,750 gallons, which gave the airplane tremendous endurance, in some cases missions as long as 30 hours with that efficient lift-producing wing and all the fuel on board. The PBY's armament, as I mentioned earlier, included hardpoints underneath both wings for a variety of depth charges, bombs, or torpedoes. Usually they carried a combination of bombs and depth charges under each wing. Each station could carry a 500-pound bomb. Or alternately, if they were going to carry a torpedo, they'd carry a Mark 13 torpedo, which weighed 2,000 pounds underneath one wing, and balance that with 500-pound bombs underneath the other wing. It was a very versatile aircraft, so it could go out and hunt for a variety of targets. Defensive armament included a 30 caliber machine gun in the bow turret, two 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the waist blisters, the PBY-5 being the first of the series to incorporate this distinctive blister plexiglass bubble back there amidships. And then a 30 caliber machine gun in a little hatch in the tail called the tunnel gun. Various marks of the PBY modified that. Later models of the PBY replaced the single 30 caliber machine gun in the nose with a fisheye bubble turret that had two 30 caliber machine guns. The Navy asked Consolidated in 1940 about the possibility of an amphibian version of the PBY with retractable landing gear to enable it to land on or take off from land bases as well as water. But as the war developed and production of PBYs became more and more important, the Navy cooled on the idea of an amphibian version. But thanks to the foresight of the company president, Reuben Fleet, he really insisted on pursuing the amphibian version. And we had, by the time World War II started, what we called the PBY-5A amphibian. This was the most versatile of all the Catalinas, even though it wasn't the most produced, but it was able to operate from land bases as well as from sea drones. The PBY-5A amphibian was thus also able to launch and beach itself on its own without the need for a large handling crew as in the flying boat versions. The airplane's construction was a semi-monocoque stress skin aluminum skin riveted over a aluminum frame. It made a lot of use of fabric covered surfaces to out of weight considerations. The rudders, the elevators, the ailerons were all fabric covered with unbleached cotton linen, as well as about the aft 1/3 of the wing cord was also fabric covered. And these fabric sections of the aircraft were hand sewn and then doped with varnish to make them waterproof and to give them some rigidity. We have covered the high points of the aircraft externally, but we have a beautiful cutaway of the PBY's main hull down in the main deck. So if you'll follow me, we'll go down there and pick up where I'm leaving off here. Every student naval aviator or student naval flight officer goes through about 8 weeks of aviation pre-flight indoctrination here at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Included in the course of instruction, of course, was about 2 weeks of land and water survival. In one of the classrooms in the old survival school here at Schools Command, when we walked into the classroom, we were confronted by this display built into the side of the building. The outside of the PBY was located on the outside, and the cutaway section was right there in the classroom. So as a young second lieutenant in the Marine Corps and a flight student here at Pensacola in 1978, I sat in a desk next to this display for the first 2 weeks of my training here at Pensacola. The PBY internally, the one thing you want to notice about the aircraft right off the bat, and which this display puts to a good appearance, is the intricate construction, aluminum construction, where you see all the transverse frames and longitudinal stringers. All of these are riveted together. Now, this was a mass-produced airplane in the San Diego factory, but this was before automation. So every part of this airplane was handmade by skilled workmen, placing all of these hundreds of thousands of rivets. In fact, in order to make the rivets tighter when they put them in, installed them, they would actually keep them in a freezer before using them, so that when they installed them, they were cold, and as they'd expand, they would make the joints especially tight. Remember, we're talking about flying boats here, so we use nautical terms to describe it. This is the bow, the pointy end of the airplane, if you will. The bow compartment was the first compartment in the airplane. There were 7 compartments total, starting with the bow. The bow observer had a defensive 30 caliber machine gun in this revolving turret. It was not a powered turret. He had to turn it manually. And he also had a bomb aiming window here. It's open right now, but it had a louvered or corrugated door to protect it during landings and takeoffs. Right inside the window, you'll notice on this display, it's complete with the Norden bomb sight. The Norden bomb sight became famous during World War II as the main tool by which the Army Air Forces conducted its strategic bombing with B-17s of Germany. But the Norden bomb sight was actually developed by the U.S. Navy to solve the trigonometry problem of how to drop a weapon from a moving aircraft and solve for distance and trajectory to make sure you hit your target. So the early PBYs had included the Norden bomb sight, which is a highly classified piece of equipment all through the war. And some people have often asked, what's this little circular port here? Believe it or not, it was a removable port so the gunner could take it out and reach his hand out in front and wipe off the windshield when it was fogged up by water spray. You've got the aircraft's mooring line, which they flew with in this position. Coming back around here, this removable mooring post. Again, these are flying boats, so when you're on the water, you're basically a vessel. And then you had this compartment here for the Danforth anchor that the airplane often used when it had to land and moor itself someplace other than where the seaplane tender might be. The pilot's compartment is next as we go aft. And here you had the patrol plane commander in the left seat and the co-pilot in the right seat on elevated pedestal seats. Here, the control yoke was actually a U-shaped yoke with 2 steering wheels on either side for the pilot and co-pilot. A basic instrument panel in front of them, and then the engine controls, the throttle, the mixture controls, and the propeller controls were located on a center console overhead. The pilots there was a walkway between them here to go into the next watertight compartment, which was the navigator and the radio man's compartment. Here you see the navigator sitting here with his chart table and his parallel rules. The sailor next to him, one of the air crewmen, probably operating one of the early radar sets. You can't see it on this side, but the other side has one of the early radar arrays attached to the outside of the hull. Just opposite them on the starboard side, facing to starboard, is the radio man's position. Early on in the war, there wasn't a lot of talk or voice radio signals sent by long range, so the radio operator actually had to use a telegraph key and send messages via Morse code. Moving further aft from the navigator and the radio man's compartment is the in-flight kitchen and the flight engineer's position. Flight engineer was located on a suspended seat up inside the pylon structure. This got him out of the way of the rest of the crew and put him in a position where he had direct control of the engines in addition to the pilots. so he could fine-tune the engines, the mixture, and they had fire extinguisher actuators for both engines in the event of an in-flight fire. He could basically do everything with the engines up there, and he had windows on both sides of the pylon, so he had the best view of what was going on with those engines on the wings than anybody else. So it was really a stroke of genius the way the designer of the PBY placed what we called then the mechanic, we call today the flight engineer. On the starboard side of the aircraft is the in-flight kitchen, and just behind that is an auxiliary power unit which provided electrical supplies to the airplane. Now, right about this point, you see a bracket here and another one here. This is where the beaching gear for the flying boat would be attached when they wanted to bring the airplane out of the water. When the amphibian version came out, they replaced these with a huge housing here for one of the main wheels. The two wheels retracted into the sides of the airplane, and that stuck out quite a bit into this compartment. So I'm not sure what happened to the in-flight kitchen. It was probably moved someplace else. We'll go back a little further aft. This was the crew compartment. Because of the long endurance of their flights, they did have bunks in here for the crewmen to take crew rest while they're in flight. Oftentimes when these were operating as flying boats and stationed in a protected anchorage and serviced by a seaplane tender, oftentimes a number of members of the crew would have to remain aboard the airplane to provide an anchor watch and maintain security, make sure the airplane wasn't taking on water. So this airplane really became their home on the water, the same way as a boat would for a boat owner. These bunks came in very handy too when they were rescuing survivors from ship sinkings or downed aircraft. They put medical cases, wounded people into these bunks and take care of them on the flight home. The PBY was manned by a crew of 8 or 9 air crewmen and officers. Moving back to what we called the weapons compartment, this was also where these very nice plexiglass blisters were located. It had kind of an eyelid arrangement here for opening and closing, and then inside of each of these blisters were pedestal-mounted Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns for self-defense. The ones we have on this sample here have their ammunition fed through a box attached to the side of the gun. Later models of the PBY actually incorporated a fixed ammunition chute that was connected to magazines in the airplane. Each gunner had a C-shaped walkway around the gun so he could operate it and give it a lot of flexibility in protecting themselves against enemy aircraft or engaging with surface targets. The last compartment back aft here is called the tunnel compartment. There's actually a hatch underneath here that they could open up in flight, and there was a mounted 30 caliber machine gun here to provide the airplane with some ability to defend itself against aircraft coming up from 6 o'clock position or underneath. From 1936 to 1940, the U.S. Navy established patrol wings on both coasts of the United States, with a couple patrol wings in Hawaii and one over in the Philippines to cover the Far East. From 1939, when the war in Europe began, the United States started flying what they called neutrality patrols to enforce the Neutrality Act, which was basically in the Atlantic to keep tabs on the movement of German naval units in the Atlantic, especially on our side of the Atlantic. And then they expanded that in early 1941 to include patrols in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea to keep tabs on Japanese naval activities. Frequently, those encounters between PBYs and Japanese fighters came close to shots being fired, but it was a very tenuous period. In 1940, with the war in Europe having Great Britain up to its neck in battle with Germany, the Royal Air Force obtained PBY-5 airplanes for their coastal command. The British found it easier to remember names of airplanes as opposed to designations, so it was actually the Royal Air Force that gave it the name Catalina, naming it after that little island off the coast of California. In May of 1941, the German super battleship Bismarck sortied into the North Atlantic with its escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, in a famous naval chase and battle that took place. The Bismarck sunk the HMS Hood, and what followed was a classic naval chase as Bismarck tried to make for Europe the safety of French ports, and for a time eluded the Royal Navy for almost 24 hours until a Royal Air Force Catalina discovered it and reported its position. And what followed, of course, was the famous battle in which Bismarck was finally damaged and brought to heel and sunk in May of '41. On December 7th, 1941, a Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor caught both the wings at Ford Island and Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station flat-footed and destroyed 52 out of 64 of the PBY Catalinas that were stationed there. What followed for the first 6 months of war in the Pacific was a battle of attrition in the Southwest Pacific, and as the Japanese onslaught continued to conquer Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and parts of New Guinea. PBY Catalina squadrons that survived the initial attacks saw their numbers dwindle greatly as they fought a retrograde action back towards Australia. Oftentimes they're put into use evacuating civilians from endangered areas, and then also trying to fly in under cover of darkness ammunition and food for surrounded American, Australian, English, and Dutch troops. On June 3rd, 1942, a VP-44 PBY-5A based in Midway Island discovered the advancing Japanese invasion fleet that was bound for Midway. What followed is that night, 4 planes from Midway, 4 PBYs, launched out to attack that invasion fleet with torpedoes at night. And the first indication the Japanese had that they were under attack was one of the torpedoes connecting with one of their oilers. It turned out to be the only successful torpedo attack of the entire Battle of Midway, conducted by those 4 PBYs from Midway on the night of June 3rd. The following day, June 4th, 1942, another PBY on patrol out of Midway spotted the first Japanese air raid inbound to Midway, and sent a very terse message back to Midway via wireless, saying many planes headed Midway. This was far in advance of any of those planes showing up on Midway's radar. This advance warning gave Midway precious additional time to get all of its aircraft off the ground, so that the first Japanese air raid against Midway found virtually no aircraft left on the ground to destroy. Following the end of the Battle of Midway, June 5th and June 6th, PBYs based on Midway again provided valuable service by going out and scouring the ocean for survivors from the multiple Navy squadrons that were involved in that famous and pivotal battle of the Pacific War. In the Aleutians, PBYs based in Dutch Harbor and later Adak Island conducted daytime bombing raids against the islands of Attu and Kisco, which had been captured by the Japanese, and continued that ongoing bombing harassment of Japanese positions until those islands, American territory, was finally taken back by the United States in 1943. In August of 1942, the United States went on the offensive in the Pacific with its invasion of Guadalcanal. Both U.S. Navy and Royal Australian Air Force Catalinas supported the operation in Guadalcanal and the surrounding Solomon Islands with daytime bombing raids against Japanese fleet units, but found that the vulnerability of the PBY really discouraged their use in daytime. They just were too vulnerable to be caught in daylight by Japanese fighter aircraft. So what followed was a period where the United States and Australia decided to use the Catalina as a night intruder, typically launching just before sunset and flying a 15-hour night mission, returning to their base, whether it was with a seaplane tender or a small a harbor somewhere in the islands, and using radar altimeters and radar to navigate and fly low and slow, again using stealth coverage and painting the airplanes black, which gave them the nickname Black Cats. The Black Cats grew claws, and with either bombs or torpedoes, they made the nightly Tokyo Express, the train of Japanese ships going down the slot between the islands and the Solomons to reinforce their garrisons on Guadalcanal, a very hazardous undertaking. It's hard or difficult to say how many American troops' lives were saved by virtue of the fact that not all the ammunition or the ordnance or the food and supplies that Japanese troops needed got to where they were intended to go, and thereby spared Americans heavier losses than they did. By war's end, Black Cat operations conducted by the U.S. Navy and the Royal Air Force sank a total of 1,500 Japanese ships of all types, totaling some 700,000 tons. As an interesting side story, in Australia, Qantas Airways obtained 5 Catalinas for use in what they called their double sunrise flights, going from Perth, Australia to Ceylon, or what we call Sri Lanka today. This was a 3,500-mile journey that took them 28 hours to fly. Because of the fuel required, extra fuel they had to take on to fly that distance, they were only able to carry a very little cargo and 3 passengers. And because most of the Indian Ocean was prowled upon by Japanese fighters, the airplanes had to take off in darkness and maintain radio silence for most of the trip. They were so heavily laden with fuel, in fact, that if they had lost a single engine in flight, they would have had to go down anytime in the first 10 hours. And they called it the double sunrise flight because of the sheer length of the trip meant that the passengers got to see 2 sunrises between the time they left Perth and the time they arrived at Kogala Lake and Ceylon. From January 1942 to June of 1945 in the Atlantic, U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and Royal Canadian Air Force Catalina squadrons covered the entire eastern seaboard from Newfoundland all the way down to Brazil to provide overhead anti-submarine warfare support for the convoys that were taking supplies, much needed supplies, to England and Russia. On the other side of the Atlantic, Royal Air Force Catalinas did the same thing, covering the North Sea, the Bay of Biscay, and the Mediterranean. Advances in anti-submarine warfare technology such as sonar, the first aerial sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and the first acoustic homing torpedo called the Mark 24 Fido gave the Allies the technological edge over the German U-boat wolf packs that were trying to prey on convoys heading for Europe and back. By 1944, losses amongst U-boats had gotten so great that the Kriegsmarine's U-boat chief, Admiral Karl Dönitz, gave orders to his U-boat commanders that if they were caught on the surface, they were to fight it out on the surface with their deck guns rather than submerge and be subjected to a one-sided pummeling from the anti-submarine warfare aircraft. So German U-boats in the last year of the war started to spring up very heavy caliber anti-aircraft guns like the 37 millimeter and 57 millimeter guns, which made life for something as slow as the PBY pretty miserable. So they were discouraged from engaging in gunfights or gun duels with surfaced U-boats. In June of 1944, a squadron called VP-63 Mad Cats deployed the first PBYs equipped with a magnetic anomaly detector, which was basically a boom underneath the rudder that had a magnetometer which would detect any anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field, like a large metallic object, say a submerged submarine. They deployed to Morocco and helped the Royal Air Force cover the approaches through the Straits of Gibraltar, catching German U-boats as they ingressed or egressed from the Mediterranean. By the end of the Battle of the Atlantic, PBYs in Allied forces, Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, U.S. Navy, and Coast Guard, had accounted for 20 of the 55 German U-boats that were sunk by aircraft in the entire war. Air-sea rescue was always part of the PBY's capabilities, and it was used throughout the beginning of the war through the 1944 1943 when the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed that a dedicated search and rescue or air-sea rescue organization, because of the size and scope of a two-ocean war, was just too much for the U.S. Coast Guard to handle alone. So the decision was made to create an organization within the United States Army Air Forces called Air Sea Rescue, and they would be equipped with, amongst other types, PBY Catalinas, which the Air Force referred to as the OA-10. These OA-10s were taken from Navy contracts and and turned over to the Air Force, given Air Force serial numbers. But the pilots and aircrew had to come here to NAS Pensacola and NAS Jacksonville to be trained on how to fly the Catalina. Dumbo was the nickname given to the PBY because of its large wing and its similar resemblance to the Disney cartoon character, the flying elephant. It became a great term of endearment, and by the end of the war, thousands of servicemen, airmen, and sailors, victims of ship sinkings, owed their lives to Catalina or a Dumbo aircraft being available to land and pick them out of the water. On August 3rd, 1945, a Navy Catalina based in the Philippines discovered and picked up the first group of survivors from the sinking of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis east of the Philippines, which had been sunk by a Japanese submarine 5 days earlier after delivering its cargo, the first nuclear bomb, to the Air Force on Tinian. After World War II, Catalinas continued to serve in the Navy reserves and in training units until the early 1950s, when they were replaced by more modern and faster flying boats like Martin's PBM and Martin's P5M. The Air Force continued to use OA-10s for another 8 years following World War II until they were replaced with the new Grumman SA-16 Albatross amphibian. And likewise, the U.S. Coast Guard started replacing its Catalinas around 1949-1950 with the new Albatross, as well as a new contraption called a helicopter. Surprisingly, foreign militaries continued to use Catalinas provided under foreign military assistance programs until well into the 1970s. They also found use as aerial forest fire fighting water bombers in Canada and North America, and for use as mission support aircraft in places like the Amazon, New Guinea, and Equatorial Africa. Interestingly, in 1971, ocean explorer and aquanaut Philippe Cousteau, the son of Jacques Cousteau, who was himself a pilot, purchased a ex-U.S. Navy PBY 6A Catalina, dubbed Calypso II, and used it in their worldwide explorations. Sadly, in 1979, while taxiing on the Tagus River near Lisbon, Portugal, the airplane struck a sandbar, wrenching one of the propellers loose from its engine, and it cut through the cockpit, killing Philippe instantly. In conclusion, the PBY was a state-of-the-art aircraft when it was first designed in 1935, but was obsolete within 5 years. But it was what the Navy had on hand. It's what they had to fight with when the war was thrust upon us in 1941, and it did its job well. Countless Americans and Allied sailors, soldiers, and Marines and airmen owed their lives to the Catalina. And as one Army combat veteran once remarked, he said, "Whenever I see a PBY, I stand and salute." And now, if you have any questions regarding the PBY Catalina, I'll do my best to answer them.
Very much, Kim, for that outstanding presentation. Catalina, a lot to talk about with this very historic aircraft. We've had some questions come in. Scott asks, how many survivors could it carry at one time in some of the Dumbo missions that it flew?
Well, a lot depended on how heavy the airplane was, how much fuel it had on board, and ammunition and so forth. And if it had a full complement, 8 or 9 man crew, I've read accounts that they said they could get as many as 20 passengers on board. Cash Barber, who gave the preface to this, was talking about their rescue mission on the Sepik River in New Guinea, where they flew with a minimal crew and unloaded all their ammunition, and they got as many as 30 of the Australian commanders on board each airplane for that mission. But that was pushing it, and it made for a long takeoff run. In the case of the USS Indianapolis rescue, I understand that the first PBY on scene loaded as many as 30 of the survivors on board, and she was too heavy to get airborne, so they had to be actually rescued by another PBY in that case. Okay.
And Lou Humphrey commented, why would they carry a healthy supply of number 2 pencils on PBYs?
That's a good question. That was a habit the PBY crewmen got into because these airplanes did not have flaps. With that big wing, the big parasol wing, and it's a wide chord as well, they frequently did what were called full stall landings, where they'd get down as low as they could, as slow as they could, and actually let the tail drag a little bit first. If they misjudged their timing with the crest and the trough of a wave, they could easily slam down pretty hard and pop some rivets. So everyone had a pencil in his pocket to use as a temporary plug to plug leaks in popped rivets or bullet holes if they took battle damage while doing their missions.
Robert asks, are any PBYs still flying today?
That's another good question. Surprisingly, there are quite a few PBYs around the world flying. I've seen estimates as high as 70 well, not flying, but 70 airplanes total in museums. I think there's probably a dozen or two that are actually still flying. In terms of the actual flying boat model, the straight Dash 5, this one we have here in Pensacola is the only straight Dash 5 flying boat, Catalina. All the other ones that are either in museums or flying status still are the amphibian version, either the Dash 5A or the Dash 6A Catalinas.
And you mentioned that the PBYs are slow in the air, not really, can't really avoid air attack. But was there any real defense against air attack if you were a PBY pilot? How could you try to keep from getting shot down?
That was a good question. Evasive maneuvers were very simple. Basically, if you were high flying PBY, you see lots and lots of accounts going back to the Battle of Midway, for example, where the reconnaissance planes were spotting parts of the Japanese fleet, and they'd draw either Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire, and they'd dart for the safety of a cloud, get into a big cloud and fly on instruments for a while until the interest in you had waned. If you were caught in a clear sky, either without clouds or at night or daytime with clear ceiling and visibility, the best maneuver was to fly, turn into their attackers and confuse or make their gunfire solution more difficult, or get down close to the water where you didn't have to worry about somebody coming up from underneath you. The 6 o'clock position on most airplanes, including the PBY, was your most vulnerable position. So they get down low and slow and again turn into the attack and try to complicate things for the enemy fighter as much as you could.
Okay, and we have time for one final question. Cooper asks, did the U.S. Army Air Force's PBYs flown in the Dumbo missions, did they carry defensive armament like their Navy counterparts?
Yes, they did. The OA-10s was what the Army Air Force designation for the PBY was. We're armed with the same kind of armament that the Navy and Coast Guard PBYs flew with. One or two 30 caliber machine guns in the nose, one in the tunnel position, window in the tail, and then two single 50s in the waist positions underneath the plexiglass blisters. Thanks very much for joining us on this episode of History Up Close. Be sure to stay tuned with social media for our next subject coming up in about 2 weeks. Thanks.